Like and follow if you love horror. We're still on chapter 4, Absentia. Okay, take trail 12 to cabin lot 8. We can talk. We don't have to bring this to the sheriff. Maybe the state boys can help. If there was something provable, they could take it to the cops. Maybe it could redeem his failures from last night. Carlos nodded at George. He looked around, almost as if to see if anyone was watching, and wandered off. Warren came down from the room and just barely saw the end of George's exchange with the team. Carlos and Warren made brief and uncertain eye contact. "What the hell was that all about?" Warren muttered under his breath as he sat down with George. "Kid thinks he knows something about what's happened last night. He wants to talk to me about it up at the cabin later," George said casually. He didn't want Warren to think that there was something wrong with the kid. "Christ, he doesn't think you had something to do with it, does he?" Warren asked. "Nothing like that. He thinks he's seen a pattern in some local disappearances that might link them to last night. Says sheriff doesn't want to listen to him. Hopes I'll collaborate with him." George looked up and saw Dean staring at them. His gaze was less cold now and more sinister. His deep look of malcontent pierced George, grating him to the bone. They looked they locked eye contact, and George certainly didn't mind giving it right back. Warren noticed the exchange and said, "Got a problem, son? You know this man nearly died last night trying to save your friend. Least you could do is try to be grateful." Dean tossed his plate down on the table and stormed off. "Shit." George felt about 10 inches tall, and the whole room was staring at them. "That wasn't the right way to handle that. I gotta stop acting like I'm the victim here. These kids lost their friend." George averted his eyes, more than just embarrassed. "I'm gonna do what I can to make it right with this Carlos kid. At the very least, I can try to help." "Hey, buddy, come on, man. What you went through wasn't easy. I can't imagine how I'd feel if it was me. No one can understand what you're going through, but I can buy you some beer." Warren tried to comfort his friend, knowing he honestly lacked the right language, but still wanted to help. George chuckled. "All right, save your hair of the dog for later. Let's grab some gear and get up to the trails at the cabin. Go round up Bronson and Patty." I'm not doing such a great read. I'm tripping all over my words today. The cabin was barely more than 2 rooms with a loft, but it had a blazing wood stove that could sweat anyone out into the frigid night, and a little kitchenette which provided a sense of civilization. It even had a shower on the deck if anyone was willing to shower in the freezing cold temperatures. An outhouse sat 20 feet away, with a set of deer antlers adorning the arc of the door. The cabin even had electricity. A generator could run the cooler and all the lights for 3 days with their current supply of gas. Just downhill, slightly from their place, was a small pond fed by a clear mountain creek. It was frozen over and covered with snow, but in the spring it was good trout fishing. Now George was in nothing more than his long johns. He sat comfortably stove-side with a beer, feet up and warming. He and the crew came in from the day of snowmobiling and dining in the town. He had a tray of cheese and cured meat at his side. The stress of the night before had almost completely melted away. But George knew Carlos would be along soon, and while he tried not to let it sour his buzz, it did hang on his mind as though with grappling hooks. The light of a snowmobile flashed the cabin, letting him know that Carlos was approaching. He grumbled, but he had invited this beast into his life, so he had to deal with it. He pushed himself up and brought his snacks back to the cooler. A few rhythmic knocks came at the cabin door. "Come in, but be quiet, please." George motioned for Carlos to enter and pointed at the bunks, signifying people were in them. Carlos looked around, taking in the cabin. At that moment, Warren popped his head up. "The fuck?" "Go back to bed, Wedgie," George said flatly. "Nope," Warren said, swinging his feet off the bunk. "I'm off for a piss." George shook his head at him and as he fussed to collect his boots, a lantern, and a coat. Don't mind him. George grabbed a beer and shook it at Carlos. So, what have you got for me, kid? Carlos ignored the beer and watched Warren leave. A high school kid turning down the chance to sneak a beer seemed odd to George. Even strange was the kid's general demeanor. He seemed rigid, moving almost robotically. Once Warren was outside, he slowly turned his gaze back towards George, but said nothing. Okay, George pulled up a seat next to the table. Why don't we start with recently? Carlos didn't move. He took his eyes off George and seemed to examine the cabin some more, like he was going over the details of its structure in his mind. Just outside, Warren took large bounding steps in what must have been 2 feet of snow. Slowly he trudged forward. His sure goal was the outhouse. Every step was a race against time to get into the bathroom. It would also be marginally warmer in the latrine. It wasn't heated, but it would be out of the direct wind. Out of the corner of Warren's eye, he saw something stir in the trees. He spun about, nearly falling in the snow. There was a slight glistening in the lantern light, as though the light was bouncing off of a mass of orbs in the trees. To be safe, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a can of bear mace. In the deep Adirondack bush, it was used for the usual things that went bump in the night. Back inside the cabin, Carlos and George stared uncomfortably at each other, as if they were about to draw at high noon. Something was off. George wondered if he'd managed to offend the young man, but was also becoming cross. Look, kid, I know this isn't what you came to hear, but I gotta tell you, I'm usually a pretty private man, and I'm not much for this stuff. You gotta start talking to me or you might as well leave, George said bluntly, trying to be as gentle as he could, given his frustration. Carlos moved to the side and opened the cabin door behind him without looking. It seemed he'd opted to leave, and George prepared an apology for snapping at the kid. As George went to speak, Warren staggered through the open door. The smell of piss and shit and sourness like a wasp hive followed him into the cabin. Warren's mouth was agape. His head contorted unnaturally, and his movements were jerky and tremoring. Even stranger, his neck was goiterous and undulating. George shot up out of his seat and tried to comprehend what he was seeing. He attempted to respond, but his mind just ran in circles. "Patty! Bronson!" George finally belted out. In a moment, Patty and Bronson were down from the loft. George hobbled to Warren's side, almost ignoring Carlos, but shooting him a dirty look as he moved in. "Wedgie, what's the matter? Talk to me." Carlos casually walked up behind George and threw him in a Marine's chokehold. George might have been on the short side, but he could easily lift his weight, even with that damn bum leg. He threw his shoulder into Carlos while trying to loop a hand into the hold, but found the boy had incredible strength. Warren turned to face George as he continued to struggle helplessly with Carlos, giving him a clear look inside Warren's mouth. A bundle of tendrils squirmed about inside. There was no tongue, no teeth, no discernible palate, like most of the head had been hollowed out down to the bone. Bronson didn't know what was happening, but he knew someone was strangling his friend. He ran up and tried to force Carlos off George. Despite his stature, Bronson was not much stronger than George. The two of them began to turn the tables on Carlos, but not with certain ease. Patty rushed to Warren, assuming he was injured. He reached out and latched onto her with a vice-like grip. Patty was no soft woman either and began wrestling with Warren's rigged body. She had an easier time with Warren alone than the two men had with Carlos. Before anyone could gain control of the situation, the lights went out and the generator outside made a grinding metal-on-metal sound. The group was left scrapping in the orange glow of the stove. Time was lost, counted only by the flickers of firelight, but George and his friend knew time was short. Bronson finally managed to pry Carlos off of George, and George spun around to assist him with taking the team down. Patty managed to put Warren face down on the ground, though he thrashed like a malfunctioning washing machine. Before Patty knew it, Warren's head popped off. Warren's head did not roll as expected. It